Welcome back to another VBA tutorial series. So today we are going to keep talking about our connection objects that we have access to inside of VBA. In our previous video, we actually worked with the collection, so the Workbook Connections collection, which is all the individual connection objects inside an Excel workbook. And so we've, at this point, I'm hoping that we're relatively comfortable somewhat with connection objects. And now we kind of understand what they are, how they work, and how we use them in relationship to the VBA object model. Now, something we are going to talk about, because it is so heavily used, is creating connections to Power Query and then importing that data from Power Query into your workbook. So the goal of this video is to not necessarily cover Power Query, just because I do that in other videos, but more to say, we got a Power Query connection. How do we use it from the VBA object model? So that's basically all we're doing. Let's give you some context. So right now, this is actually from a different workbook that the final product is all out. I have a giant table. This wonderful giant table is simply a list of CIK, so central index key numbers that are associated with a particular ticker symbol and a particular name of a company. So this is something that is hosted on the SEC. That is basically their master list of all CIK numbers that then match up with their ticker symbol. So that way, if you want to search a company by CIK number, you can do that. And it's basically just relating the two pieces of information. So very useful, definitely comes in handy, but you can also note that sometimes it's a little bit weird where it's like, okay, so we have multiple CIK numbers associated with different, ticker symbols. So, nothing crazy. But regardless, how is this data even coming in here? Well, if I go into my Launch Power Query editor, we'll see a query that will load. And if you go to View, Advanced Editor, you will see the query for this particular topic. And so all it is it's grabbing a URL, and that URL returns a JSON document in essence. So it's just a giant JSON string that we then convert to a table of records. And then we take each one of those records, we expand it, and we change some column names, and we basically change some data types. So you first get this massive thing back that has individual records, and then we convert it to a table. We expand those values, we remove a column, and we change the type. So nothing too crazy. Very simple query. But how do we now leverage that query that we've built, and maybe we haven't actually put it into our workbook? How do we put it into our workbook and then maybe import it directly into our Excel workbook? So definitely useful. So what we're going to do is we're going to jump into a different workbook that doesn't contain it. And we're going to go into our Visual Basic Editor tab. And we're going to use some code that we have from our previous video. And we're going to add a bunch of other, a bunch of other strings and variables associated with it. So pretty much everything up here can stay the same. I don't think we need we do need extended properties. We need data source, provider, we need type, connection name, connection description. Down here, we are going to define a few more. There is query name. So this is the name of our query. We're then going to do query description. That will also be a string. And then every query has something called a formula. That formula is basically the Power Query query itself. And so that's a string as well. So really, in essence, it's not too many, but you do need to declare a few other variables if you want to be very explicit about what variables you're going to be doing. Now, technically, the only reason I'm doing this is because I have option explicit on. I don't technically have to do this, but I think it's a good habit to get into. Now, from here, everything is pretty much exactly the same, but now we're going to start going through the process of defining some of our components of our query string, right? So part of it is we're going to give query name. In this case, we're going to call it SEC _CIK numbers, something like that, right? So that's our name. We can give it a description. So query description, and we'll call it query description. That will equal a connection to the SEC website where all the CIK numbers are stored. Just, something basic, nothing super fancy. And then from here, here comes the fun part. So here's the deal. When you copy it, you can copy it into VBA. You can copy your formula. It's messy. And there's very limited things you can do to make it look pretty. It's just what it is. So just to save myself the absolute nightmare of trying to recreate this by typing everything, I am not going to type it. Normally what you can do is you can just copy it. Well, you can't necessarily copy it, but if you record your macro, you can do it. There's also other ways of doing it. You can put it in a separate file and load that file. But regardless, you have a query formula, and that query formula is basically a giant string. That's literally all it is. It's a giant string. You have to be very careful when you write this, because if you were to type it manually, you are leaving yourself open to so many opportunities to make a typo. Do it differently. If you're going to use it, import it from a file. That's what I would say. If you really want to do it kind of from scratch, import it from some type of file. And then once you've done that, then you can use it. Because otherwise, it's not going to look pretty and you're going to make mistakes, I can guarantee you. I remember a long time ago when I started my wonderful YouTube series, and I think like 2 months in, I covered this topic, and I remember that one because it was just so easy to make mistakes. That, and was relatively new to it, so I was making all sorts of mistakes to begin with. Regardless, you basically have your query formula, and your query formula is just the giant query itself. It's just a giant string that represents it. So you can see like, okay, JSON documents, okay, convert the table. Okay, so basically it's just the M reference language that you're using. That's all. So once you have that formula, you can add the query to the queries collection. Now, to do this, you have to go to Excel Workbook, Queries, and then you're going to do Add. And then you're going to do Name, and then it's going to be Query Name. And then the formula is going to be Query Formula. And then the description is going to be the query description. And then because I am not doing anything special with that, it's fine. Technically, if you wanted to as well, you could do something like Excel Workbook, queries as queries, right? So these are all the queries inside your particular workbook. And then you could do something like, grab the queries collection, which basically means you set that Excel workbook queries equal to the Excel workbook dot queries. And then you're really just going to replace this with this. So it's a little bit more formal, if you want to call it that. And then from here, we have our query that we've added. So this adds the query. This doesn't do anything beyond that. That just adds the query. From here, even though we have a query, that doesn't mean we have a connection. So even though we have a query that exists in our queries collection, it doesn't automatically create a connection. So what we need to do is create our connection. So we've got to define our connection components. So define connection type. Well, for queries, it's very straightforward. It is simply an OLEDB connection type. So very simple, nothing too crazy. We are then going to define the provider. The provider is basically the Power Query engine itself. And with that one, it's called Microsoft. You want to make sure you spell it right. Mashup.OLEDB.1. So this is the mashup engine that is used in Power Query. Mashup because, think about it, I can take all my data and mash it up under a single engine. And it still uses OLEDB technology. So this is basically your driver in a sense that's saying, hey, the connection I'm about to make is going to use this particular engine in order to do it. And it's an OLEDB connection. Then we need to define the data source. How does that look like? In this case, it's the workbook. So what that means is where is it? Yeah. In this case, what I'm saying is it's going to be $workbook, close off the string. We're saying that this connection or this data source is internal. It's inside my workbook because the query inherently lives in my workbook. So that's why we specify the data source as workbook, because the query inherently is existing in our workbook. You can know that because you're grabbing the queries collection that exists in this workbook. So that's why. Here's the confusing part. This is sometimes where things get a little confusing. Define the location of the data source. This is where I think I did this more to myself than VBA did it. The location is the data. So it's weird because we're saying the data is really the name of the query, because the query inherently is returning a table that's been cleaned and all that wonderful stuff. So the location of that table, you almost kind of say it probably makes more sense to name this location and this data source, because this is saying where is it located? And then this one is where is the, yeah. Interesting. Hold on a sec when we do that. I'm going to wait a little bit of a second, but we'll just keep it the same. I would technically flip those, so I don't think that's actually correct. Define the final component, which is the extended properties. It has to look exactly the way I'm going to do it. If you do not put it like this, it will not work, and it will not tell you why it's not working. So just be very careful. Double quote, double quote, double quote, double quote, double quote. So you need 6 double quotes altogether. So 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. It has to be 6 double quotes. If you do not put 6 double quotes, it will not work, and I can promise you that. So now that we've done that, what we're going to do next is we're going to build the connection string. So build the connection string. Connection string is equal to connection string type, and it's going to be plus semicolon provider, spelled exactly like that, no other way, plus connection string provider plus sign underscore, and then semicolon, data source with a space, proper casing, plus connection string data source plus, and then it's going to be semicolon location equals plus connection location, and then plus space underscore our not our final one, semicolon extended space properties equal, close your quotation mark, connection extended control D properties, and then it's gonna be plus quote quote inside your quotes a final semicolon. After that, we can print it all out, and just to save myself some time, I'm not going to do that. Then from here, we're going to put it in here. Okay, now that we've done that, it's going to, what is the word? It's going to print it out to us. So now we should have a nice looking, connection location. Connection string location. Yeah, again, there's a lot of opportunity here to make a mistake. Isn't it fun? Because I know somebody, you know, you're going to have a coworker who asks you to do this and you're going to be like, God help me. Connection string location. Come on. Oh, I hate myself sometimes. Like, it's just the freaking typos. Okay, so this is our final connection string. This is what it's going to look like. Now what we need to do is we have to add the connection to our workbook. So at this point, we literally just have a connection string. That is it. We haven't actually added it to the workbook. So what we're going to do here is now we're going to define something completely different, which is the connection name. The connection name is simply SEC query connection. Then from here, we're going to do connection description. And with this one, it's going to be connection description is Power Query connection to the SEC CIK query. From here, we now need to define the SQL query. And so with this one, it's going to be SQL underscore query equals select star from bracket, bracket, close it off. And then inside those brackets, do 2 quotes, space, space. And then from here, do ampersand. And then it's going to be the name of our query and then ampersand. So that's where you're selecting your data from. You're selecting your data from the query table, which, if you go up here, is the name of the query. So that is the name of your table. Once you've done that, you basically have defined all the components you need in order to create your connection. Now, at this point, we've done this enough times. I'm just going to copy it, again, just to save myself some time and not be too repetitive. But we're going to define our name of our connection, our description. I'm going to change this to connection string. We have our SQL query. It's still Command SQL. I do not want to add this to the Power Pivot model, and there are no relationships to import from this query. So ideally, from here, I should be able to add it. It's because it already exists. That's right. So one of the downsides is, I know. God. So I'm going to delete it. But nice thing is here is you can actually see that it did do it. But I'm just going to delete it for right now because I already technically have it and I don't really care about it at this point. Well, I care about it, but I don't care that much about it. So there were no errors. So at this point, I should be able to go here. And if I look, I can see that my data was imported successfully. So that's really good. I have my data source. There might be some properties about my particular query. Well, apparently not. And then also I have a connection to this query. So this is probably why I think doing anything related to Power Query from a connection object is so complicated, because you're not just creating the query, you're creating the connection too. So even at this point though, like the data is still not even in our workbook. Like we've only defined the connection and we've only defined the query. We haven't done any type of import yet. So we can see those connections. We can see it here and I can tell you like, hey, here it is. Here is my connection, right? Now, what I could do is, that's kind of scaring me that it won't let me. Ooh. I hope there's not a typo. Sometimes there's a typo. Usually a way at least just for me, this is how I determine if there's a typo. If I can't do certain things like edit connection properties, that usually scares me because that tells me something might potentially be broken. Not all the time, but sometimes. So I like to be extra cautious with this because it can be problematic. So I apologize in advance if I'm already like hesitating to move forward. I mean, we'll see in a second, obviously, but hopefully nothing too crazy at this point. I guarantee you it's this little thing right here. I swear to God. Let me do something. No, it's 6. Okay. Oh, hold on. You see that right there? You see how it was lowercase d, not uppercase? You wouldn't think that would matter. It matters a lot. It matters an awful lot. An awful lot. So see, this is what happens. I get paranoid and I know for a fact something's not right. Like I've done this enough times. I've broken it enough times. Like I know when it's supposed to work and when it's not supposed to work. That should have worked. So now if I go here, let me see. See, now it works. That is such a big indication that something went wrong. And that's why I hate doing these things, because the connection string literally is the only thing that is off. And it's something really stupid like a lowercase d when it should have been an uppercase one. And all of a sudden it doesn't work. And it doesn't tell you or anything. That's why I hate this stuff so much sometimes. But now you can hopefully not make that mistake. Or if you do get an error, you have an idea of potentially what went wrong. So now at this point, we've created a connection. We've defined our query. Let's import it into our wonderful, into our Excel worksheet. So what I'm going to do, again, just to save myself the headache of doing some repetitive task, I'm going to just import some stuff that we already have. So we've talked about most of these objects in the first video. So list object, we've talked about that. Query table, we've talked about that. The OLEDB connection, we've talked about that. So this is, at this point, hopefully should look pretty familiar. However, all we're doing in this example is we are grabbing the connection that is related to our SEC query connection. So basically we're grabbing this guy that we just created up here. That's really all we're doing. And now that we have that connection, what are we going to do next? Well, it kind of depends what you want to do with it, but I want to put mine into a list object, so a table, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to grab the OLEDB connection object that's associated with it. So grab the OLEDB connection from our workbook connection object. And so what we're going to do is we're going to set our Excel OLEDB connection equal to our Excel workbook connection. And then it's OLEDB connection. And then from here, we now need to define the worksheet we want the data to live in. And so we're going to set our Excel worksheet equal to this workbook dot worksheets, and then it's my underscore power query, and then it's uppercase. From here, we're now going to add that Power Query connection to that list object. So add the connection to the list object. So set Excel PQY table equal to Excel worksheet dot list object. So all the list objects, add source type Excel source external. A little weird, right? Because you would think this is internal. It's not, for whatever reason. This one is actually external. Source is going to be the Excel Workbook connection. Remember in my last video where I said you would think it's this one, right? It's not. The source is technically from this, because if you add this one, it's going to create a second connection, and then it's just weird because it's like, well, here's the second connection that's really the same one that we defined up above, but because we didn't specify it correctly, we don't know that that's the one we're talking about. So you want to use the workbook connection. You don't want to use the OLEDB connection until later down in the code. Next, it's going to be destination. And with destination, it's going to be Excel worksheet dot range a bracket. Okay, perfect. So a lot, but nothing too crazy. So we've added our list object. At this point, we have a list object, and then what we're going to do is we're going to grab that query table that's associated with our list object. So grab the query table. So we're going to set Excel PQY query table equals Excel PQY, and then table, and then that query table property, which returns the query table object. And then with our query table, we're going to say with Excel PQY query table. Dude, these tongue twisters, I do this to myself. I hate this. Okay, so now we want to define the command type, right? So define the command type. Remember, this is basically just saying, like, hey, how are we going to pull this data in? Like, we're going to be using basically a SQL command. So we're going to do dot command type, and then Excel OLEDB connection, and then we're going to do command type. Define the command text. And then with this one, it's going to be dot command text equals Excel OLEDB connection dot command text. Next, we're gonna just do more formatting. No. Here, refresh the data to pull it in. And then we're gonna say dot refresh background query colon equal false. Background query, okay. And then do not adjust column width. And then this one will be adjust column width equals false. This is just me being very, very picky. And then in this case, I actually want to do something a little bit different. I want my design to be table style light 16. Perfect. Table style light 16. So we're going to do with our list object property, call the table style property, and have that equal table style light 16. So basically for table styles, just do the name that you see when you hover over it, and then just remove all the spaces. Change the style. And then refresh style basically says like, okay, when we refresh this data, like what do you want to have happen to the cells, right? And so one of the things that you can specify is you can say, okay, refresh style can be basically insert, delete cells. So basically like insert cells when you need to insert, and then delete cells as you remove them, insert entire rows, overwrite cells. Normally, in 99% of the cases, just do insert, delete cells. There are other options there, but for the most part, they're very rarely used, at least in my opinion. Set all the rows to a height of 25, and we're going to say dot list object dot range dot rows row height, and then equals 25. And then this is, no, I'm not going to do the comments. List object dot range. Yeah, range. Columns, column width equals 20. And then list object dot range dot cells vertical alignment equals Excel Control J vertical. Where is it? Align. Excel vertical. Well, we might not be doing vertical alignment because I can't remember what it is. Sorry. Yeah, and there's other stuff in here too. You know, there's refresh on file open. So do you want to like have that happen? And with this one, it equals, I just say false. Like, so basically what we're saying is like, hey, every time you open the file, like do not refresh it. Do not refresh when opening the file. There's some other stuff in here. There's a record set property, which is kind of interesting. So you can actually grab it as a record set. That's kind of neat in my opinion. Result range, robust connect, row numbers. So for example, if I want to put row numbers, I can say put true. So turn on row numbers. There is, where is it? Background query. That one's like true or false. And then like, I think you can set the time with it too. You can actually set how often you want. Edit web page, enable refresh, enable editing. So you can even turn off editing too. I've never actually done that. So and say false. So I'm basically saying like, you know, you can't touch it. I don't want you touching my, you know, query table. Don't touch it. And then there is post text, refresh style. Oh, I already did that one. Where is it? Reset timer. I think that's going to say how often you want it to update. Refresh period. Yeah, I think refresh period is saying how often you want it to refresh. And then there's a bunch of other stuff in here too, but you don't need to really care about that at that point. Source connection file, you can sort, say password, save as ODC. So it's kind of weird because it's like a connection, but it's also like this query table. So there's like certain properties that are specific to it, but you know, it's interesting. Regardless, let's see what happens. I want to basically close this and I'm gonna go here. Hopefully it works. Hey, it worked. So at this point, we now have a wonderful query. So here's a little something to keep in mind. When you do things with a query table, you might not see the change right away because what can happen is if you don't call it early enough in, and then all of a sudden you run it, basically, it's not going to show it. So like, for example, I was dumb to put row numbers down here because inherently I'm calling it after refresh. So I won't see those row numbers until I call refresh again. So I either have to manually click it or I'd have to somehow call in a VBA. So just keep that in mind. There's certain things where you're like, well, Alex, it's not showing up. Like, why is it not showing up? Guarantee you it's probably because you put it before the you put it after the refresh, and so you're just not seeing the change yet. So, you know, just keep that in mind. Like, I made that mistake so many times and I'm like, why is it not working? But now here we can see like, okay, so cool. Like there's, you know, row numbers and all that stuff. So that's kind of neat. I wonder if I can edit it. Oh, I can edit it. I guess editing didn't turn it off. See, now I'm curious. Like, what does that mean? Excel VBA query table. There it is. Properties. Enable editing. True if the user can edit the specific query table. False if the user can only refresh the query table. But I turned it to false. Didn't I? Yes. I wonder why that didn't work. That's weird. I'll have to look into it. I'm not sure, because you would think it would turn it off. Now, there's certain properties you can define here too. Like, for example, I can say, that's weird. Yeah, on this one, they don't seem to, you know, I don't know then. That might be something different. Or it could be on the table design too. Sometimes like the properties are a little bit spread out. But normally you can usually see it from here and it will tell you. I mean, most cases, but you know, maybe that's just not the case here. Because like, you know, like here, for example, you can't see properties. You can see the name of the table, for example, but it's nothing super fancy. You can load to, yeah, there's all that, edit. So that's just edits the query. I mean, that's nothing fancy. You know, I'm just kind of curious. Yeah, still lets me do it. Interesting. Oh, and also, I don't know if you guys knew this, but so it's really weird. They have this new little, because I'm on the insider version of Office, and so you can actually get data from table and range. It's actually an option from when you right click on a cell. So like, for example, if I like say, oh, well, I just want like this little portion, right? I've never tried on actually like a small portion, but I think it only does the range. Well, I guess in this case, it's doing the table, but basically it's just a function how they've now added into the dropdown. I mean, it's nothing major, but you just see little things like that. You don't see, and then you see like, oh, interesting. But yeah, I think at this point, that's pretty much it. So if you have any questions related to Power Query connections, feel free to put those down in the comments below, and I'll do my best to help with those ones. Those ones can be complicated, especially when you have pretty complicated queries, and you know, there's just a lot of opportunity for something to go wrong. But it is possible to control it from VBA, so you know, it is there if you want it. Otherwise, in our next series, I think for right now, I'm gonna call it off for the connections, because the only one we have left is SQL and text files. And to be completely honest, those ones are, you know, you're going to look at them like, Alex, there's like barely anything different from the Excel file one. And so I think my next video is probably going to be related to parsing SEC filings, just because I was working a little bit more on that one, just trying to clean some stuff up. Because it's a pretty confusing topic, but I think I've gotten a good spot now where it's pretty good. And then after that, we're going to cover Excel functions using the JavaScript API. So we're going to see how to create our own custom functions that do a whole host of things, ranging from basically returning arrays to doing web requests to a whole bunch of other stuff. So that's a really important topic for anybody who is planning to use the Office Excel API, because you're going to have to know how to write formulas for that particular API. So very exciting stuff coming up. Otherwise, we will see you in the next video.